Most people think the story of Greenland begins with the United States. They remember the headlines. A sitting American president openly talking about buying an entire island. The jokes, the laughter, the disbelief. It sounded absurd, almost cartoonish. Why would anyone want Greenland? A frozen landmass, buried under ice, with more polar bears than people. But that reaction reveals something important. It reveals how little we understand Greenland, and how badly we misunderstand power. Because by the time the United States publicly showed interest in Greenland, the outcome was already locked in. The rules had been written decades earlier, and the biggest loser wasn't Denmark. It was Russia, long before American air bases, long before the Cold War, long before satellites and nuclear submarines. Russia tried to shape the fate of Greenland, not with armies, not with invasions, but with something far more dangerous: precedent. And when that attempt failed, Greenland stopped being a frontier forever. To understand how that happened, we need to unlearn something modern politics has taught us: that conquest always comes with violence, because the most important battles over territory are not always fought with guns. Sometimes they are fought with definitions. Greenland is the largest island on Earth. It sits between North America and Europe like a massive white shield dominating the North Atlantic. If you stare at a globe long enough, a pattern emerges. Greenland does not sit at the edge of the Arctic. It anchors it. Its position controls the air routes between continents. Its coastline shapes naval access to the North Atlantic. Its ice sheet influences weather systems across the entire northern hemisphere. Whoever controls Greenland doesn't just own land, they own leverage. That is why Greenland keeps reappearing in history, even when no one is paying attention. And that is why the real story of Greenland is not about ice, it is about law. For most of history, empires expanded in simple, brutal ways. They sent explorers, they planted flags, they built forts, they moved settlers in. If someone resisted, armies followed. But by the early 20th century, that world was disappearing. The First World War shattered Europe's tolerance for open conquest. Millions were dead. Empires were collapsing. Borders were being redrawn in conference halls instead of battlefields. Yet ambition did not disappear. It adapted. Empires still wanted land. They still wanted resources. They still wanted strategic positions. But they wanted them without war. And that forced a fundamental change. Territory would no longer be taken only by force. It would be taken by interpretation, treaties, agreements, legal doctrines. Whoever controlled the meaning of sovereignty would control the map. Russia understood this shift earlier than most. Russia has always had a geographic problem. It is enormous, resource-rich, and strategically boxed in. Warm water ports were scarce. Access to global trade routes was limited. Western choke points were controlled by rival powers. For centuries, Russian strategy revolved around breaking out of containment, south toward the Black Sea, west toward Europe, north toward the Arctic. The Arctic offered something no other direction could: space. Vast, frozen, sparsely governed space. No dense populations, no clear borders, no settled legal norms. To Russian strategists, the Arctic was not empty, it was unfinished. Across Siberia, Russia had already perfected a particular form of expansion. Slow, incremental, legally ambiguous. They did not always arrive with armies. Often they arrived with traders, surveyors, scientists. Presence came first, claims came later. And once those claims existed long enough, they hardened into permanence. This approach worked because few people challenged it. But Greenland was different. Greenland was not just land, it was leverage. It sat astride the northern Atlantic like a gatekeeper. Any power that controlled it could monitor movement, shape access, and project influence across entire continents. For Russia, Greenland represented something it had always struggled to obtain: a way out, a way around containment, a way to push influence westward without confronting Europe directly. But there was a problem. Greenland was already claimed, at least on paper. Denmark claimed sovereignty over Greenland, but its control was uneven. The western coast was administered. Trade monopolies were enforced. Danish law technically applied to the entire island, but the eastern coast was another world entirely. Thousands of miles of ice and rock. No towns, no police, no permanent Danish presence. To a lawyer, this was a gray zone. To a strategist, it was an opportunity. And to Russia, it was a question that demanded an answer. Can a nation really own land it does not physically occupy? If the answer was no, then Greenland was vulnerable. And if Greenland was vulnerable, the Arctic was open. Russia did not rush in. That would have been reckless, too visible, too provocative. Instead, it waited. Because history often provides test cases, moments where one country makes a move, and everyone else learns from the outcome. Russia needed someone else to challenge the rules first, someone smaller, someone emotional, someone close enough to Europe to force a legal response. They did not have to wait long. Norway was already looking north. In the early 20th century, Norway was rediscovering itself. After centuries of political subordination, it had regained independence and was searching for identity. Like many young nations, it looked backward, to Vikings, to exploration, to lost glory. Greenland loomed large in that imagination. It wasn't just territory, it was unfinished. For centuries, Greenland had been tied to the Norwegian crown before political unions and treaties transferred control to Denmark. To many Norwegians, that transfer never felt legitimate. It felt administrative, temporary, wrong. Norwegian trappers were already operating in East Greenland. They hunted there. They built cabins. They survived winters in conditions most Europeans would never endure. To them, Denmark's claim felt abstract, paper ownership. And in international law, abstraction is fragile. All it takes is one challenge, one physical act that forces theory to confront reality. One flag. When the decision was made to sail to East Greenland in 1931, the men involved did not think of themselves as pawns. They thought of themselves as pioneers. They came from a country shaped by the sea, fishermen, seal hunters, trappers, men who understood isolation better than diplomacy. For them, Greenland was not a chessboard. It was survival. The journey alone was brutal. Small ships pushed through pack ice, storms that could erase you in minutes. A coastline so hostile it seemed designed to repel human life. When they finally reached land, there was nothing waiting for them. No harbors, no towns, no signs of sovereignty. Only ice, rock, and silence. To the men on the ground, Denmark was invisible. And in geopolitics, invisibility is dangerous. They chose a small inlet on the eastern coast, Migbukta, Mosquito Bay. A name that felt almost mocking in a place where cold killed faster than insects ever could. They built a rough cabin, stored supplies, established radio contact, and then they did something that would ripple far beyond the Arctic. They raised a flag. At first glance, it looked like a simple act. It was anything but. Flag raising has always been the language of empire. It is not just symbolic, it is legal. A declaration that says, this land answers to us now. In earlier centuries, this would have been followed by soldiers. But in 1931, the rules had changed. This flag was not backed by cannons. It was backed by an argument, a dangerous one. The argument was simple. If Denmark truly owned Greenland, where were they? Where were the officials? The towns? The patrols? On the eastern coast, there were none. And in a world moving away from conquest by force, absence mattered more than history. When the order was given to raise the flag, it did more than occupy land. It forced a question into the open, one Europe had been avoiding since the end of the First World War. Could a nation still expand quietly without war by stepping into empty space? Norway believed the answer was yes. And across the world, others began watching closely, including Russia. The moment the flag went up, the issue stopped being Scandinavian. It became global. Denmark understood this immediately, because if Norway succeeded, Denmark would not just lose part of Greenland. It would lose the legal foundation of its entire claim. And once that foundation cracked, it would not stop with Norway. Others would follow. Quietly, legally, relentlessly, the Arctic would become a free-for-all. So Denmark made a decision that stunned everyone. They refused to respond like an empire. Instead of sending warships, they sent lawyers. And with that decision, Denmark dragged the entire Arctic into a courtroom. Every unresolved question, every ambiguous claim, every silent ambition, all of it would now be tested in law. Far from the ice, far from the men who raised the flag, and far from those who were watching, waiting to see whether the frontier would reopen. Denmark's decision to answer a flag with a lawsuit did something extraordinary. It turned Greenland from a piece of geography into a question of philosophy. Because once the case went to The Hague, the world wasn't just asking who owns East Greenland, it was asking, can the wilderness be owned at all? And if the answer was yes, then the Arctic would be frozen into borders forever. If the answer was no, the Arctic would become the last great scramble on Earth. That is why this case mattered. Not because Mosquito Bay was valuable, but because Mosquito Bay was a doorway, and powerful nations were waiting to see whether it could be opened, including Russia. At the heart of Norway's argument was a deceptively simple idea, terra nullius. Nobody's land. It sounds neutral, almost harmless, but it is one of the most powerful weapons ever used in international politics. Terra nullius argues that land without recognized authority belongs to no one, and if it belongs to no one, it can be taken. This idea built empires. It justified colonization across continents. It turned silence into permission and absence into opportunity. By the early 20th century, terra nullius was already being challenged in many parts of the world. But the Arctic was different, because the Arctic did not fit traditional definitions of occupation. You couldn't farm it. You couldn't build dense cities across it. You couldn't administer it like France or Germany. Life itself resisted permanence. If terra nullius applied anywhere, it applied here, and that terrified Denmark. Denmark understood the chain reaction. If the court accepted Norway's argument, Denmark wouldn't just lose East Greenland. They would lose the logic that held Greenland together as a single territory. And once that logic cracked, other powers would begin carving. Not loudly, not violently, quietly, with weather stations, scientific expeditions, cabins, survey lines, temporary presence that would slowly turn into permanent claims. The Arctic would dissolve into a contest of endurance. Whoever could survive longest would own the most, and Denmark knew they would lose that race. Norway, meanwhile, believed it had the most unbeatable argument imaginable. The east coast was empty. Denmark had no towns there, no officials, no police, no administration you could point to with your finger. Norway argued that sovereignty must be effective, that it must be real on the ground. They didn't even need to sound aggressive. They only had to sound logical. And to the Norwegian public, it felt obvious. How can Denmark own a land it doesn't inhabit? But that logic contained a hidden trap, because if sovereignty required full physical occupation everywhere, then no polar claim on Earth would be secure. And that would not just reshape Greenland. It would rewrite the Arctic. It would rewrite Antarctica. It would turn every uninhabited island into a prize. That was the nightmare Denmark carried into court. Russia saw that nightmare differently. For Russia, it wasn't a nightmare. It was an opening. Russia had no flag at Mosquito Bay, no cabin on the east coast, no announcement of annexation. But Russia had something older than any flag, a method. For centuries, Russian expansion had moved through spaces where borders were weak, undefined, or contested. And the Arctic still contained places like that. If Norway won in The Hague, if the court declared that empty land could not be owned by paper claims, then the Arctic frontier would reopen. Russia would not need to invade Greenland. It would only need to exploit the precedent. It could argue that claims must be proven by presence. It could quietly expand its activities across polar regions and transform temporary footholds into recognized reality. That was the game. Norway was making the move. Russia was waiting to see whether the move would be legalized. The trial itself became a war of paper. Denmark didn't stockpile ammunition. They stockpiled documents, old treaties, administrative decrees, maps, records of diplomatic recognition. Norway didn't mobilize battleships. They mobilized historians, because the judges weren't being asked to measure morality or pride. They were being asked to define sovereignty. When the hearings began in The Hague, the Peace Palace filled with diplomats and journalists. Not because Greenland was beloved, because Greenland was a legal landmine. 15 judges sat on the bench. They came from different continents, different legal traditions, and different interests. They were not Scandinavian. They had no emotional attachment to Viking history. To them, this wasn't a fight between brother nations. It was a test case, a precedent, and everyone in the room knew it. Norway went first. Their presentation was clean and intuitive. They pointed to East Greenland's emptiness. They emphasized Danish absence. They argued that Denmark's claim was theoretical, a phantom sovereignty. They stressed the idea of effective occupation. And then they brought up what made their argument feel so morally sharp. For centuries, the people actually living and moving in East Greenland were Inuit hunters. And in modern times, the only outsiders present were Norwegian trappers, not Danish officials. Norway's message was simple. You cannot own what you do not control. To many listeners, it sounded modern and fair. It sounded like common sense. Then Denmark stood up. And Denmark did not argue with Norway's logic. Denmark attacked Norway's premise. They told the court, the Arctic cannot be judged by the standards of Europe. In a temperate country, occupation could mean towns, tax collectors, police stations. But in a polar wilderness, where life itself fights permanence, the standard must be different. If you demand European-style occupation in the Arctic, then no nation can own the Arctic. So Denmark offered the court a different standard. In extreme environments, sovereignty can be proven by intent and governance, by acting like the landlord, even if you don't live on every square mile. Danish laws applied to Greenland. Danish monopolies regulated trade. Danish expeditions mapped and researched the island. And crucially, other nations had treated Greenland as Danish. Denmark wasn't claiming it occupied every inch. Denmark was claiming it administered the whole, and then Denmark revealed the detail that ended the case, a forgotten promise. Years earlier, in 1919, during a diplomatic conversation, Norway OS foreign minister had reportedly assured Denmark that Norway would not object to Danish sovereignty over all of Greenland. It wasn't theatrical, it wasn't signed with ceremony, it was casual. And that made it deadly. Because in international law, casual words spoken by the right person can bind an entire nation. The room changed. Norway's lawyers realized instantly what had happened. They weren't just defending geography anymore. They were defending their credibility. Norway tried to escape. They argued the statement was informal, that it was misunderstood, that no minister could give away territory over drinks. But the judges didn't care about the mood of the conversation. They cared about authority. A foreign minister speaks on behalf of the state, and states are expected to keep their word. This wasn't just a legal blow, it was a moral blow. Norway had walked into court believing logic would save them. Instead, they were trapped by their own past. Outside the Peace Palace, Scandinavian tension boiled. Boycotts spread, newspapers screamed, pride hardened into anger. But inside the courtroom, the decision was becoming inevitable, because the court wasn't just deciding who owned East Greenland, it was deciding whether the modern world would tolerate quiet expansion into uninhabited land, whether the frontier still existed. Months passed, thousands of pages were submitted, and while men in Mosquito Bay continued surviving winter and keeping the flag alive, the real struggle was being decided by judges reading documents under warm lights. Then the date arrived, April 5th, 1933. The courtroom was silent. The judgment was read. Denmark won. By a large majority, the court ruled that Norway's occupation was illegal. Denmark's sovereignty over all of Greenland was affirmed. The reasoning mattered as much as the outcome. First, the court held that in polar regions, physical occupation requirements are lower. Intent and governance can be enough. Second, the court accepted Denmark's continuity. Greenland had been treated as a single Danish territory in international practice. And third, the final nail, the court treated Norway's earlier assurance as binding. Norway had promised not to interfere, and now it couldn't pretend it hadn't. In Norway, it was humiliation. Headlines darkened. The dream collapsed overnight. But then something remarkable happened. Norway accepted the verdict. They ordered the flag lowered. They withdrew their men. They did not sabotage the station. They did not burn the cabins. They did not dare Denmark to remove them by force. They obeyed the gavel. And in that moment, two nations proved something rare, that law could prevent war. But the real defeat was not Norwegian. It was Russian. Because, with that ruling, Terra Nullius in the Arctic effectively died. No state could now argue that empty ice belonged to no one. The Arctic was no longer a legal frontier. It was closed, claims hardened, borders froze in place. The long strategy Russia depended on, slow expansion through ambiguity, could no longer operate in the same way. Not around Greenland, not in any similar polar dispute where sovereignty could be claimed by intent and recognition. Russia didn't need to protest the verdict to feel its effect. It understood the message perfectly. The door it hoped might open quietly had slammed shut, locked by law. Decades later, the world changed again. The Cold War began. The Arctic transformed from wilderness into strategic high ground. Air routes mattered, radar mattered, missiles mattered. The United States built bases in Greenland, not because it owned Greenland, but because Denmark did. Denmark could invite allies. Russia watched from a distance, unable to contest the sovereignty itself, because the legal foundation was already cemented. That is the irony. By the time the world's superpowers arrived to fight over the Arctic, the most important battle had already been fought. And it had been fought with paper. In recent years, Greenland returned to the spotlight. Politicians spoke as if it were still negotiable, as if the Arctic were still up for grabs. But it isn't. The legal war was fought long ago, and it was decisive. Before the United States ever cared about Greenland, Russia tried to shape its fate, not with armies, but with silence, patience, and precedent. And it failed. Greenland wasn't conquered. It was closed. Closed by judges, closed by words, closed by a ruling most of the world has forgotten. But every modern Arctic dispute still lives in its shadow. Every base, every claim, every ambition, all constrained by a verdict delivered in 1933. Because once the rulebook is written, even empires have to obey it.